Welcome to this podcast from the PCPLD Network. This is a space where everyone's voice is heard, a series to open up conversations about life, death, grief, and people with a learning disability.
Hello everyone, welcome to our first ever podcast. I'm Irene at Tuffrey-Wijne. I'm a trustee of the PCPLD Network and Professor of Intellectual Disability and Palliative Care at Kingston and St George's University in London. Today I'm going to think about the words we use when we talk about death with people with learning disabilities, or intellectual disabilities as it's also known. Very often in our society we don't use the words dead and dying, we use euphemisms. What is that like for people with learning disabilities? I got together with Gemma, who is the chair of the PCPLD Network, and she's Diversity and Inclusion Lead at the Mary Stevens Hospice in Stourbridge.
When you asked if I would join you for this podcast, I started to think first about why people don't use the correct language and why people use euphemisms rather than using the words death, dead, dying.
Remember we put this out on Twitter, didn't we, this question, what euphemisms do you use? And it was hilarious. I mean, it was things like being promoted to glory and to wear
I quite like that one.
Onesie. That's the one I made me laugh.
the wear the wooden onesie one, so that came about from a Marie Curie poll that they did last year.
All right.
And like you said, we put it out on Twitter and that was one that came up, wear a wooden onesie. That really made me laugh. And the other one that I really liked was Coco Popped It.
No,
Coco Popped It. The person said that was one of the answers within that survey was Coco Popped It. And it took me a few moments to link it to the cereal and then work out what it meant. Imagine saying that to somebody with a learning disability and someone's sleeping. How confusing is that, and how frightening? Because then you could think that when you go to sleep, you're not going to wake up either.
Absolutely. And I think I've seen that poll, and I think it said from Marie Curie, at least this is good because at least people are talking about it, whatever words they use. But the thing with people with learning disabilities is if the word isn't completely clear, then it is utterly confusing. So I know some people with learning disabilities who use very colourful, unusual terms for death. And then I would repeat that. So I know one man who consistently says, when somebody takes their final journey, when they've taken their final journey. So if I were to talk to him about death and dying, I would use that because he uses it. And I know for sure that what he means and how he understands, taking my final journey means that he's dead. But with anybody else, it's just, I have so many examples of where people have misunderstood words that we thought were really very clear. And some of these examples, actually, when you tell them, quite funny, but actually it's also really rather sad. So there was one man that I knew who, when people said, oh, he's gone to heaven, he misheard that consistently as he's gone to Devon. So when at one point he was invited to go on holiday to Devon, he was terribly excited because he thought he was going to see his friends there who had died and he hadn't seen for a long time. He said, I'm going to Devon, I'm going to see my friend. You have to really think about what something sounds like. And then you have to really sort of think what the meaning of it is for somebody. So I've heard of somebody else who was convinced that heaven was at Highgate Cemetery, which is a cemetery in North London, because she'd been told that grandma had gone to heaven. Now, she'd been to grandma's funeral and she'd seen the coffin with grandma in it go into the ground at Highgate Cemetery. So the logical conclusion is that this is where heaven is. Heaven is the cemetery. Gemma and I got together on Zoom with 4 people with a learning disability: Samantha, Vince, Michelle and Peter. We asked them what words they had heard people use to describe death.
6 feet under.
No longer with us.
Yeah, I've heard that expression. I've used it myself from time to time. Another expression which I've heard, pop on clogs, or clogs on toes.
Never heard that before.
That's the classic example, you know, if you switch the news on, if you scroll through Facebook, if there's announcements of somebody's death, very often it will say so-and-so passed away on. I saw a tweet go out last night from an NHS trust that said that. So you think if we working within the health and social care sector aren't using the words, you know, how do we then expect others to? My son's a cricketer, so he's involved in a lot of these different cricketing online groups. And one came through again on Facebook just before Christmas, and it was announcing the death of a chairman from this cricket club. And rather than saying this man had died, they said that he'd had his last innings. So my son, who's 13, said, what does that mean? Does that mean he's retired from cricket? And reading through, I said, no, it actually means he's died. And whilst it was a lovely way to contribute the fact that this gentleman had been a lifelong cricketer, they did also need to reiterate that his last innings had meant that he'd died. But so do you think, I mean, it all comes down to communication, doesn't it?
We asked the group what they thought about some of the euphemisms for death. Some people understood them, but most thought that they were confusing.
Autistic people, mostly, they take things literally, take what they people say at their word. So if you say, we lost your mum, that you've gone, you mislead a person and you've got looking for her.
When they say that, it means that they're up in the sky, doesn't it? When they say that they've gone to a better place, it means that, you know, them in the sky, they're not actually here in person.
They've moved to a new home or something, to a better place.
What do you think this means? If people hear this word, they say, my aunt has passed.
Maybe when they say, like, someone's passed, it means that they're not coming back alive again.
Passed an exam, passed someone in the street.
I'm very sorry, but we've lost your mum. What do you think of that?
I hear this mentioned a lot nowadays. Kick the bucket or kicked the bucket, when somebody has kicked the bucket, but not necessarily kicking a bucket. Some people, I think, would find that confusing.
So what do you think it means if somebody said, Dad's pushing up the daisies?
Pushing up daisies.
No, I haven't heard that one. Well, I think at face value, I think he was doing a bit of gardening.
When the staff member said, your dad has gone to heaven, was pointing up to the sky when he was saying it, probably without realising he was pointing. But the man he was talking to noticed him pointing, and at that time there was an aeroplane going over. So ever since then, that man had thought that when you died, you've gone in an aeroplane. So every time there's an aeroplane going over, he's waving and says, bye, Dad. You know, he thinks he's Dad because of that. So you have to be really careful about what words you use and how they're heard and how they're understood by the people you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some refer to a specific religious belief, don't they? You know, so they're going to heaven, going upstairs, things like that. I can remember one gentleman that I worked with last year. This is more around bereavement, if I'm honest, but when his mum died, somebody told him that his mum was always going to have a special place locked in his heart. But for him, that really worried him, because he said, Gemma, how can mum be inside my heart? How did she fit in there? And what happens if I accidentally let her out? So for him, that was causing so much additional grief and anxiety, because he just couldn't understand how mum could be locked in his heart. And that was just, you know, a genuine comfort, I suppose, from somebody else when they initially spoke to him. But for him, it just completely threw him, and we had to go through the whole conversation about his mum's death and what happened, and no, mum herself isn't locked in his heart, and so forth. And that led to a conversation with
That makes me think of actually almost an opposite example of a man with Down syndrome who was a close friend of mine. I thought he'd understood death and dying, but then when I asked him, you know, one of the standard questions is to figure out is if somebody with a learning disability, do they understand that people who are dead will never come back. So it's the permanence of death. It's universal. It happens to everybody, and people, once they're dead, they don't come back. So that's the way of figuring out whether people really understand what dead is. But he sort of said that his mum was still alive, and I thought, well, maybe he misunderstood. But then he was saying, because she's always still alive in my heart, right?
Okay.
So for him, clearly the danger would be that you misunderstood what he knows, but actually it's just to do with the way he describes it and the language he uses. So I think that again points that we really need to make sure that we use language that the person themselves uses and understands. And we have to check that whatever we say is understood like that by people. So it's completely fine. I mean, there's lots of people with learning disabilities with whom I will say that people have gone to heaven, because I know that they understand that in the way that I mean it, right? But you always have to check that with every individual. It's just interesting how difficult it is to get the D word over your lips, dead and dying. I remember once doing an exercise with a group of staff and I having to role play to tell somebody that somebody has died. And lots of the staff literally could not say the word dead. They just simply couldn't get it over their lips. They found it so difficult to say this person is dead, this person has died. But when I ask people with learning disabilities, what word should we use? What do you think? They look quite puzzled and they just say, well, just say he's dead. Say he's died. Yeah. What's the best word to use for dead? Well, my suggestion is dead, you know. Actually, that's exactly what Michelle said in our group.
And I'd say that they've died.
It all comes down to communication, doesn't it? And the way we communicate things. And with people with learning disabilities, we know that often we have to keep, chunking and checking almost that what we say they understand, and, repeating it back and so forth. And I mean, I'm picking up on what you said earlier about using the language that's comfortable to that person, as long as they understand it.
I would if somebody has died, if it's somebody that is close to me, I remember my mum died, to then actually say out loud to somebody else, my mum has died, suddenly makes it much more real, and that is quite difficult. It shocks ourselves. Every time we hear ourselves say it, it shocks us. Goodness me, my friend, my mum, she's died. That is part of important process of helping somebody to understand and to accommodate in their life this huge change that somebody has died. The first thing you have to do is to really understand that it's true. And of course, the difficulty is that for many people with learning disability, understanding what dead and dying and died is quite difficult. So it may well be that if you say somebody's died, they still don't understand it and they still don't know. So you have to back that up with action, with making something real and tangible as much as you can, involving people in the rituals around death and dying, taking people to funerals, talking about the person who's died with a photograph and a candle, or there's all manner of things that we can do. But it has to be backed up with the very clear language. And as you said, if you say, oh yes, he's gone to sleep, well, I mean, my experience is when people go to sleep, they wake up. That's what you think. So
Gone to bed, gone to sleep, catnap.
Or having a bit of shut-eye. They might not know what the expression means.
If you can go to sleep and never wake up, as you say, that is a really quite scary prospect, isn't it? So you have to really make a distinction. He's not gone to sleep. No, he isn't sleeping. He is dead. He can't wake up, because people who are dead don't wake up. Because it's such a difficult, scary subject that nobody wants to think about. It also means nobody wants to talk about it. But if you talk about it in flowery, disguising terminology, then it just makes it worse for people. It makes it so much more difficult to understand what's happening.
It becomes the elephant in the room, doesn't it? Everybody skirts around using that word. Nobody wants to say it. Often, people with learning disabilities have been shielded. Some of the learning disability homes that I've worked in, they haven't necessarily always informed residents of that home when somebody's died. And how confusing is that when you come for your breakfast one day and a key member of your group is no longer there?
It's so shocking. And I still hear examples of people with learning disabilities not being told that even a parent has died, that their mum has died, or their dad has died. I keep hoping that it is something from from a few decades back, that it no longer happens. When people used to always be told dad is on holiday or is away working. That's a very long holiday. It's lasting years and years and years. And I know people particularly people who've grown up in institutions, who are actually frightened of going on holiday because they think you never go back. That's what they used to be told. That person's gone on holiday when somebody actually died. But it still happens. It's hard, but at some point you're going to have to tell the person. It's much more shocking to have mum not visiting because you think she's on holiday, or is she not interested? I mean, it's much better to say actually she can't because she's dead.
A care worker I spoke to, this person's died, and she said, "Oh, we don't want to upset him." Well, actually, the death of this friend is going to cause upset, and that's completely normal. And you just need to create the space to speak about the person, to remember them in whatever way is comfortable with you and the rest of the people that live within this home. To be upset is normal. Best to be upset and speak through it, and continually speaking through it if need be, than the confusion because all of a sudden we've got a missing person.
People with learning disability, emotions and so is no different from the rest of us. And just imagine that somebody would not tell you that your mum has died because they're worried that you're going to be upset, right? I was very upset when my mum died, but thank goodness. I mean, I was, if somebody hadn't told me, that would be even worse, wouldn't it? That would be terrible. So what did our group of people with learning disabilities think? If someone had died, how would they want to be told?
Yeah, mostly we have to be truthful about it, but tactful.
And Peter, how can people do that? How can they be truthful and tactful?
Explaining things clearly, carefully, and not in such a way that upsets them too much.
It's really, really hard, and you have to take it in like in a stride, but you can't because it just hurts you. It hurts your heart.
It depends on other people and how they want to say it, but I either say my aunt or my pet or my uncle, one of my members of my family have died.
As Samantha said, it is hard, but for me their take-home message is, tell me the truth. Be kind, but tell me clearly. Don't confuse me. Use words I understand. Use words I'm familiar with. And as Michelle said, don't be afraid to say it as it is. The clearest words to use are these. He has died. He is dead. I'm sorry. Thank you to Gemma Allen and to Samantha Reeves, Vince Peters, Michelle McDermott and Peter Allen. And thank you for joining us in our first ever podcast. Let's keep these conversations going.
But I have to say, wearing a wooden onesie is one that's going to stay with me. I think that's just the most glorious, isn't it? I mean, I think from all, it's going to be my favourite, actually.
Absolutely. And I've never heard it before that, Paul. I think that's wonderful. And I also like doing the final moonwalk. I think that's a nice one.
You listened to an episode from the PCPLD Network Podcast series. Thank you for joining us. For more information and resources, please visit our website www.pcpld.org. We are also on Twitter and Instagram. Take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time.